Um, ok. Boa noite, na verdade, boa tarde ainda, né? Nós estamos aqui com o professor. Eu queria só, então, dar início aí aos nossos trabalhos aqui da rede. E. Ok. Né, quem teve aí presente aí, viu na semana passada, semana passada, nas semanas para trás, a rede teve aí toda uma discussão com uma série de temas muito relevantes da política internacional e autores relevantes também, particularmente o professor Atílio Boron, internacionais, né, como o caso do professor Atílio, e particularmente um tema que não foi tratado, foi a discussão, basicamente, pensar a questão ou focar um pouco mais nessa questão da pandemia, das discussões a respeito do Covid, não é isso? Do coronavírus e tudo. Então, para isso, a gente tem o prazer de estar aqui agora, de contar com a presença do professor Kees van der Pel, quem teve um mínimo de contato com a literatura, né, de inspiração gramsciana nas relações internacionais, lembra dele. Professor Kiss é professor aposentado da Universidade de Sussex, professor aposentado da Universidade de Amsterdã, e eu vou passar a palavra para ele falar com a gente hoje. Eu já tenho um convidado aqui também, né, que está aqui presente. Está aqui presente ele também, aqui querendo... quem sabe faz ao vivo, né? Você sabe onde é que está o enxufe, né? Está lá na sala, no aparador. Sim. E então, como eu estava dizendo, professor aposentado aí dessas duas grandes universidades, com grandes publicações na área. Eu de que destacar esse livro, opa, cadê a câmera? Esse livro, recentemente publicado em português, né? Que é é o último livro do professor Van der Pel. Ele está escrevendo agora um livro sobre o Covid, a economia política do coronavírus, né? Que esse vai sair mais para frente. Mas esse aqui eu tive o prazer de traduzir também. Quem viu a divulgação do evento viu o link para o livro, né? Da editora Fino Traço. Fica aí a dica para o pessoal. E hoje a fala vai girar um pouco em torno disso, um pouco em torno também da questão do Covid, né? E a economia política dessa dinâmica aí do medo, como o professor colocou. Well, no more things to say. I'll pass to you, Professor Kees. Thanks a lot for your presence here. Thanks a lot for your book. Thanks a lot to let me to translate it. And please feel free to talk to us your considerations.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Leo. I feel very grateful that you have taken this up. The book is now in Portuguese. I haven't seen it yet because the mail is very slow these days. It's in English, in German, and Russian. In my own country, it's a taboo subject, the downing of MH17. You know, you're not supposed to say anything about it unless you were willing to repeat the official verdict, which is that the Russians came in with a Buk missile and shot it down. That's an untenable position. I can't say that I know what happened instead, but this is not what happened. And the issue of flight MH17 at the moment is very topical again, because we have the trial in The Hague. And the trial is taking an unexpected turn, because everybody expected it would be one of these show trials like the Yugoslavia Tribunal or the International Criminal Court, but there's a very effective defense. And that defense is so effective of the one person who has been indicted, who actually recognizes the court, that the Dutch government has taken the incredible step of not waiting for the verdict of the judge, but to lodge a complaint last month against Russia with the European Court of Human Rights. So the suggestion is that they already know what happened and don't want to wait for the outcome of the trial. And that makes the issues that I raise in the book, again, topical. Nobody expected that. People were already beginning to forget about it. The book, had the original title, Prism of Disaster, and I'm happy that the Portuguese translation that you did again put that up front, because the idea is that it's not an adventure book about how the plane was shot down, but it treats the downing of flight MH17 as a prism through which a number of major events are being refracted. And that concerns the capsizing of the international balance of forces after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It concerns the dependence of Europe on Russian energy sources. It concerns the advance of NATO into the former Warsaw Pact area and even into the Soviet Union, properly speaking. And it also concerns the resurrection of a sovereign, relatively strong state in Russia under Putin after the disastrous Yeltsin years. So all these things come together, as it were, in the MH17 tragedy. The most important of that, in my view, is the new Cold War with Russia and also with China. It's often forgotten that already, as I show in the book, that already in the case of the civil war in Ukraine that followed the coup d'etat in February 2014 involved China. It was directed against China, and I document that in the book. And what I see now, what I see today, is that from beginning with 9/11, the terror attacks in New York and Washington, through this new Cold War with Russia and China in the background, also smaller issues like the Charlie Hebdo massacre, the French magazine, the Skripal affair in England, and other issues. But now the coronavirus epidemic, it reminds you of the fact that we are living in a period that is characterized by the politics of fear, in which successive states of emergency are imposed on the population. And what I want to do is to first speak of this politics of fear. Why is there a politics of fear? Why should people be intimidated by dramatic events to make them submissive to power? And then I'll speak about the advance of NATO into the former Soviet sphere of influence, which is very important and related, and which ends with the third issue, and that is the mass popular revolt that is taking place these days. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor of President Carter in the late 1970s, and an important figure in the Democratic Party, in his last book, I think it's his last book of 2012, spoke of the prospect of a new 1848, which was the uprising in Europe of all the peoples. And he says something like that is brewing again, and I'll be speaking about that because that turn of events has given rise to the formation of two rival transnational ruling class blocs. And these blocs are battling it out today. One is a ultra-conservative bloc with even fascist traits, and the other is a centrist bloc, but also aiming for imposing a state of emergency. And I think these two blocs are clashing now in the run-up to the possible re-election of Donald Trump in the United States. And they are using the coronavirus epidemic as a particular form of a politics of fear. Now, first about why do we have a politics of fear? That requires that we briefly go back to the post-war era. After the Second World War, capital in the West was compelled to grant concessions to the working classes, to farmers' organizations, and of course to the middle classes, which were closest to them. And that led to a period of class compromise centering on industry, national industry, with Keynesian type of policy, or at least the intention to pursue such policy, that lasted from the 1930s in the United States and 1940s in Western Europe to somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s. In that period of class compromise, the working class was relatively strong. Where it became too strong, there were already at that time military interventions. You in Brazil are better, you know much more, you're better informed about what happened in Brazil in 1964 than I am, but I would say that military intervention was based on the idea that the working class was advancing too much. And of course, 3 years later, something like it happened in Greece, Chile in 73, Argentina 76. You see that wherever this class compromise went too far to the left, the ruling classes intervened, of course, with American support in the background. They intervened to stop the class compromise altogether. But in Europe too, and in the United States, in the 1980s, the original post-war class compromise was vacated by capital. The capitalist class withdrew from that compromise. It felt strong enough to liquidate the industrial basis in the separate countries and to move abroad. And in that process, finance, which had been suppressed in the post-war period, resurfaced, became stronger again, and in connection with the number of structural changes, like the abandoning of the gold cover of the US dollar, the gradual freeing of financial markets, you can see that there is a resurgence of finance in the 1920s way, which then led to the Great Depression, and a narrowing of the class compromise initially to the middle classes. So asset-owning middle classes, people with their own home, etc., could see the value of their assets rise, and that still tied them to the ruling class, properly speaking. But in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that financial world, the financial capital, became dominated by the speculative element, by what Marx calls money dealing capital. And you began to see financial raids across borders, the plundering of countries, forcing them into bankruptcy, the playing on exchange rate differentials, and so on and so forth. And that meant that at that point, there was no longer the possibility of any meaningful class compromise, although there were, of course, remnants. I also still have a pension, but the younger generations no longer can look forward to something like that. And all these other material elements of class compromise are fast disappearing. Now, in such a situation, the ruling class can only command the loyalty of a population by effectively telling them there are major threats to your well-being, to your life even. And the only people who can protect you is us. You may hate us, you may loathe us as a political party or political tendency or whatever, but we can offer you the protection that nobody can. And that is what I call a politics of fear. And you can say that with the attacks of 9/11, with the new Cold War in Russia, against Russia, that is the topic of my book. And now with the COVID, we have a politics of fear and an accompanying imposition of the state of emergency, which, as we know from the Nazi lawyer Carl Schmitt, is the ultimate sign of sovereignty. It shows who is actually in power. But the fact that you have to show that you are in power, of course, shows that your power is becoming precarious and contested. Now let us look at the second issue, the issue of the NATO expansion. Because in the run-up to the re-election of Trump, re-election or not being re-elected in coming November, the role of NATO is extremely important. NATO's advance to the east is, of course, one of the main topics of my book. What was NATO about? You may already be completely familiar with this, but I have to repeat it. NATO was primarily set up formally in 1949, but there were already negotiations for over a year, starting in April 1948. NATO was primarily about securing the internal situation in the countries that were eventually member of the alliance. It was never a military alliance in the sense of a preparation for a battlefield situation with an enemy who was going to attack, because all the reports that are available about NATO planning, military planning, show that the idea of a massive assault by the Soviet Union was never taken serious. So NATO was not a military organization, it was an internal security organization. And why is that so important? Because in the current presidency of Trump, the Europeans are beginning to doubt, European governments are beginning to doubt whether the United States will actually live up to this guarantee. The idea was that with strong communist parties in Italy, France, Greece, Belgium to some extent, the United States would always be available to assist with their suppression, as actually happened in Greece and in Turkey. So when European governments are beginning to doubt the American guarantee in this respect, something very fundamental is beginning to crack. And you can see that in the fact that in 1965, there was a first major crisis in NATO when de Gaulle withdrew France from the military organization of NATO. And that was because he felt, well, he had certain ideas about a joint nuclear policy. He had certain ideas about common stand in areas like Vietnam or North Africa, which he felt were being violated. But very essentially, he feared the revolt of his own military, who were plotting with the United States to get rid of him. And NATO was very important in that. NATO provided cover for a coup d'etat in France. And that was for de Gaulle the reason to withdraw. When France returned to the military organization, it was in 1991 when the crisis of Yugoslavia was entering a new stage. You know, there was already a tension. Yugoslavia found itself with an enormous foreign debt in hard dollars after the death of Marshal Tito. But only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the French and the French capitalist class realized that now that there would be a reopening of the entire East European sphere, they shouldn't be outside that process. So France joined in again and found itself involved in Yugoslavia as a result. So France came back for that reason, and NATO was united again, but with continuing serious frictions, internal frictions. So once the politics of fear became a reality with the attacks of 9/11 and the response, the initial response to invade Afghanistan, for a number of reasons that take us too far to discuss here, but which had little to do with the presence of bin Laden and the supposed perpetrators of the terror attacks, serious rifts between the United States and Europe began to develop because the European countries, the member countries of NATO, had to sign up to the reasons for the invasion of Afghanistan without being able to actually study them. They simply were presented with the need to invade on account of the claim that bin Laden, with the protection of the Afghan leaders at the time, had blown up the towers in New York and so on. In 2008, friction between the United States and Europe rose to a new height when, in the later stages of the enlargement of NATO into the former Warsaw Pact, George W. Bush actually proposed at a conference in Bucharest in Romania, a NATO conference, that Ukraine and Georgia, former Soviet republics, should be made part of NATO, just as the Baltic countries, also former Soviet republics, had been included into NATO in 2004. In 2008, Germany and France, and as I was told, the Netherlands as well, rejected this proposal and said that's not possible. And these frictions between the United States and Europe concerning the position of Georgia, which later made the mistake of attacking Russian peacekeepers in the breakaway province of South Ossetia and was humiliated there. But these tensions over Georgia and Ukraine resurfaced again in 2014 when the United States supported a coup d'etat by Ukrainian ultranationalists. I won't go into that because thanks to your kind help, Leo, the book has been translated into Portuguese, and I give the details of this coup, the preparation, and the consequences for EU-United States relations in great detail, almost from day to day at some point, because they are crucial in understanding why, in the event, flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. NATO was in a deep crisis then. let's not forget that when MH17 was shot down in July 2014, there was on the agenda a NATO summit in Wales, the English province of Wales, in September. And everything pointed to a disaster in the making, because the only issue on the agenda was the Afghan quagmire, the impossibility of coming to a real breakthrough in Afghanistan, which was an official NATO mission. It was only thanks to flight MH17 that a new enemy could be officially declared, accompanied, of course, by an outbreak of indignation, because everybody knew from day one, thanks to our media, who had done it. A new enemy was found, and that was the figure of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. That is what we have in terms of the politics of fear. You know, people really were fearful, and there was a deep hatred of Russia, which even penetrated the sports pages. You know, the doping issues about Russian athletes. All these things were intended to make Russia an illegitimate state. There's no point, of course, that I would be speaking for Russia. I have nothing with that country. I'm not a citizen of that country. But whoever looks soberly at the facts will see that the accusations made against Russia are completely out of proportion and are part of an attempt to paint that country and the figure of Putin, who's demonized, especially in the darkest colors. So that's chapter 2 of the main chapter of the politics of fear. But now get to this issue of the response to the popular revolt, because of course the war on terror led to wars like Afghanistan, Iraq, the regime change in Libya, a disastrous war in Syria, which is now being followed by murderous international sanctions imposed by the United States, in combination with the absence of a class compromise. You know, that governments and ruling classes have nothing to offer anymore except basically fake news. That is what governments offer to create fear in the population, of fear of terrorists, fears of Russia, fears now of China, fears also of a virus which nobody can see. And that is a fear which turns out to be far more effective than anything that has gone on before. I mentioned, and that gets me to the third point, I mentioned Brzezinski's prediction that he saw a new 1848. 1848, you know, the year of revolts in France, another revolution, revolts in Poland, in Hungary, the year in which the Communist Manifesto was published. I mean, that was an explosion of popular aspirations, and Brzezinski said something like that is happening again. And what he saw was the revolts in East Europe, of course, which were very, very welcome to him as a former Polish aristocrat, having moved to the United States in the 1920s. He had seen the Arab Spring, and I won't go into the aspect of the so-called color revolutions, where United States non-governmental organizations and propaganda organizations assist popular revolts, steering them into a certain direction and effectively organizing seizures of power from below, which is a new art form that the EU has developed theoretically, but also put into practice in many cases. But they were real revolts. These were popular revolts. And since Brzezinski wrote in 2012, many more have, of course, occurred. And they have been brought under the general heading of populism. Basically, the peoples of the world are becoming impatient with war, with the end, with the absence of real progress, with the absence of meaningful engagement with the population by the governments. It's only fear mongering, panics, states of emergency, one after another, and that is something that the peoples are unhappy with. They're also unhappy with media who are blindly following the government line in all the issues that I mentioned, because one of the characteristics of 9/11, of Charlie Hebdo, of Skripal, of COVID now, and of course of the issue of MH17 and the new Cold War, one of the characteristics of these mostly dramatic events and fear-inspiring events is that they are taboo. You're not supposed to ask questions. What actually happened there? Which forces may have been involved besides the ones that are officially mentioned day in, day out? Now, the populist revolt is not in itself politically charged. It doesn't point in one direction or another. It's as it were available for capture. And the one force which has most successfully captured popular discontent, whether it is the Yellow Vest movement in France or the anti-European sentiment in many European countries, or the anti-establishment sentiment in the United States, is a right-wing network, a far-right network, an extremist network that was organized by companies like Cambridge Analytica, which helped Trump to win the 2016 election, and figures like Steve Bannon and his Breitbart organization, which best understood as a sort of press agency with political intentions. That network, the Breitbart, Cambridge Analytica, other people like Mercer, Bannon, was consciously targeting the mainstream centrist coalitions of center left and center right, which were pressed together to such an extent that it's best to call them simply centrist. It hardly matters whether we're looking at Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher. They're all clustering around the core of the political class, intimately connected to the new financial sector, which is dominant, as I said at the beginning, in the whole economic and class configuration. But the Bannon network organized the elections and assisted, advised the elections not only of Trump, but also of your own Bolsonaro in Brazil. And they advised and worked for the Brexit campaign in Britain that took the United Kingdom out of the European Union. In Europe, they support Marine Le Pen in France. They support Salvini in Italy. And these are all politicians who are able to exploit the deep disaffection that exists between the mass of the population and the centrist governments in power, which are connected intimately to the dominant financial sector. Now, the question is, how does this coalition, the Bannon bloc, let's call it the ultra-right transnational coalition with fascist traits, I don't have to explain that to you. How does that relate to the alternative centrist condition, the centrist bloc that it faces, and that in many ways is much more powerful? That in Europe, in the Atlantic area, is connected to NATO and the NATO internal security apparatus, which therefore, when NATO was threatened by the President Trump, who said that NATO is obsolete, and when Trump, in addition, made insulting moves when he met Merkel, for instance, Chancellor Merkel of Germany, he didn't properly address her. He didn't shake her hand when she offered it, and that sort of minor things can be extremely important in destroying the chemistry between leaders, which is necessary for a bloc like that to function and to operate smoothly. And when he at the same time was more interested in having personal meetings with Putin and with Xi Jinping of China, that of course was experienced by the centrist government of Europe as an insult, because they were left out of these maneuvers altogether. So was Japan, by the way. Very important in the formation of these political blocs, these rival transnational coalitions, was a change that occurred in the United States in 2010, and that was a decision by the Supreme Court in the Citizen United case, which granted the right of free expression, the freedom of opinion, to corporations. And that led to a campaign finance change, which effectively handed the political system of the US to the billionaires. And the billionaires, from that moment on, from 2010 on, began to finance their own favorite candidates for the presidency in 2012. The year that Obama had expected to be re-elected, they began to finance them big time. Obama was lucky because all the right-winger oligarchs and billionaires who used these new rules to begin to support their own candidates all had different favorites. And but nevertheless, Obama had to turn to billionaires, his own billionaires, friends among that class, to win the 2012 election in the end and to finance the enormously expensive campaign that he was going to follow. And basically he was saved at that time by Bill Gates. Bill Gates was the most important figure who in 2012 rushed to the rescue of the Obama re-election campaign. And that is an event that has led to, that has had enormous consequences. You have to realize that when I speak of the politics of fear, we're not talking about an abstract mass psychological phenomenon. Naomi Klein, whom you will know from her fantastic book, The Shock Doctrine, argues in that book that every instance, every event that can be used for instilling fear in the population also has to bring profit to interested parties. And this is where these different blocks come in. The far right bloc versus the centrist bloc. Because 9/11 and the new Cold War with Russia were primarily profitable for the military-industrial complex. But the COVID campaign, the COVID emergency, and the state of emergency that has been imposed on populations the world over brings a profit to a different coalition. And that coalition is the pharmaceutical industry, which is now working on a new vaccine and a new remedy, although according to many doctors, there is already a cheap remedy available, but that's a different matter. And that block of pharmaceutical industry is closely imbricated with the Gates Foundation, which since the withdrawal of the United States from the World Health Organization is the largest donor to the World Health Organization. And it's also connected to other major foundations, because these foundations are the supports, the main supports of the transnational centrist coalition that consists of the Democratic Party and even large parts of the Republican Party in the United States, that many of your own governors belong to, and some of the large concerns in Latin America as well, that most European governments belong to. They are all interconnected through Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum in Europe and the United States, the Bilderberg Conference, the Trilateral Commission. In a way, we're looking at a transnational network in which this centrist dominant transnational bloc is organized, and from which, on the other hand, the transnational far-right extremist, sometimes even fascist bloc, is largely excluded. These are important landmarks to understand where the different forces are located. And my feeling is that, that's what I end with, just to show you that the world history didn't end with the downing of MH17, but that as part of this politics of fear, it continues in a way on different fronts. But the timing of the COVID epidemic, which concerns a nasty virus that you shouldn't get, especially not when you're ill, when you're already ill and aged, and etc., but which in terms of its actual death rate is comparable to the sort of flu epidemic that we've seen many times before, without having lockdowns, daily announcements of the number of victims, and so on and so forth. But I can only explain the timing of this epidemic, and it's being labeled a pandemic in relation to the prospect of a re-election of Trump. Because after the NATO security apparatus, so in the United States, the CIA, the Atlantic Council, you name it, had failed to undermine Trump and to depose him, the last card they could play was mobilizing this vast network of foundations and companies which are connected to the fear of a large medical emergency. And that's not something that they pulled out of a hat from just for one day. That is something that goes back to the earliest day of the war on terror, when the Patriot Act, for instance, was rushed through Congress in the United States with the help of anthrax letters, so letters containing a very dangerous toxin, to the head, for instance, of the Senate Majority Leader of the Democrats, Tom Dashley, and since then, the fear of bioterrorism, the use of pathogens to create havoc as out of terrorist motivations, has run through the security preparations in the United States and in the West at large. The fantastic book important book, I shouldn't say fantastic, but important book by Patrick Silberman, Tempête microbienne, which means microbial storms, of 2013 is a source that you shouldn't miss on this topic. He shows how long there was already consideration of the danger of such an epidemic, but also how the response of a population to lockdowns and a state of emergency would evolve, whether population would actually accept it. Likewise, there were important reports by the Rockefeller Foundation, etc., that I won't bother you with. The point is this: since at least 2001, and in important respects, of course, the dictatorships and the strategy of tension in Italy, for instance, that went before, were rehearsals for this, but only in 9/11/2001 did we see a real international scare, fear mongering of unprecedented scope occur. After that, we had a new Cold War, and now we have COVID. All these events show that from that time on, so from the beginning of the new millennium, people in the West, and also in countries like India, Russia and China are, of course, already authoritarian countries, but also in your own country, people are being ruled by fear, in which rival transnational coalitions are fighting each other for control, and in which one of them, which is unfortunately the fascist-oriented ultra right-wing one, associated with Bannon, with Steve Bannon, with Breitbart, with Cambridge Analytica, etc., is gaining the confidence of large sections of the population. And what I wanted to do, and that's my last sentence, with the book Prism of Disaster on the new Cold War and the shooting down of flight MH17, is to try to raise the understanding of these instances of the politics of fear to a point where we begin to see that for people of the left, people who dream of a just society in which equality, the security of the planet as our sole habitat predominate, that for those people, neither of these two coalitions, not the centrist one with all its foundation and its big money, and not the fascist one, of course, but that we have to step outside this struggle and try and revive a left political tradition which really looks to the future. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor. It was a pleasure. It was fantastic, your speech. I think that you said a lot of things that I thought that was fantastic reading and having the honor to translating to your book, in your book, and also some pieces on COVID. In fact, I would say in Portuguese including. Professor Keys is now organizing also a book on the political economy of COVID, right?
Well, it's basically a book about what I just was explaining. You know, that we have a series of events in which a politics of fear is being developed from different angles, from the military-industrial complex, from the pharmaceutical complex, and so on. And that is what I'm busy with, and it's a fascinating topic.
Só para alguns aí, ele está terminando de escrever um livro sobre esses processos, né, que vão aí dessa militarização, Covid, essas dinâmicas todas, e a economia política desse processo, uma espécie de economia política do medo, né? Professor, I don't know if you're seeing, but we have some questions. I can make it to you if you want it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. In this new Cold War, when thinking about an ideological bias, it would be possible to think about a confrontation that would take place in between those in favor of nationalisms and the projection of national powers and the valorization of globalist and transnationalist initiatives.
Yeah.
That's one question. The other one, and if the new international situation permeated by the American retraction of its leading role and its international leadership in the great areas of international cooperation would not be a presage of the end of a liberal order and the emergence of a new one. And another one, if this new international situation permeated by the American retraction of its leading role in international leadership in the great areas of international. It's the same. Okay, I was just reading again the same question. And Tatiana Beranger, I don't know if you know her, a very close friend of George. She's thank you and asking you should like to listen a little bit more about the conflicts between the class fractions. How do you see that conflicts between China and transatlantic forces? I think that this question, in fact, we had three questions concern these two first questions and three questions concerning the same or a main theme. That's China. Tatiana wants this to ask you about this conflicts between class fractions. Ana Raquel would like to ask you about if China and US, how is going to be the relationship of China and US post COVID-19 relations. If China will keep a contending position or it will be included in the Lokian heartland. And the third one from Caio, how is the relationship between these two capitalist blocs and the states of Russia and China? Caio, a little bit of this is in the book, but professor is going to tell you a little bit more. But that, and also I would like to ask you something, but maybe my question it's in some sense between Tatiana and Ana Raquel and Kai, because I would like to understand a little bit more. How do you see this class relations, fractions relations, in a context of in a context of structural transformations? You know, from one side, the increasing emergence of China and its importance in the global political economy. From the other side, this declining US and the conjuncture. It's a kind of perfect storm when you have a kind of the problem of the juncture and the problem of the structure and a tornado together with a hurricane, and then it mix and get bigger then. But up to you.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that is really important, I'll just start with your own point. One of the things that I didn't mention was the role of finance. I said at the beginning that, after the war, industrial capital was the dominant factor in the social compromise industrial capital, employing organized labor, and so on. From the 1980s, that shifts to finance. Finance becomes more important. It becomes the real driver of the transnationalization of capital. And in the end, it's being overtaken by speculation altogether. Now, in 2008, all the attempts by which the capitalist classes and governments in the West had attempted to maintain a measure of compromise had failed and came down crashing. You know, in 2008, that's a thesis of Wolfgang Streeck in his book Buying Time. You know, he said after the start of the crisis in 1968, governments tried to use inflation to keep labor more or less happy. Then they used private debt and state debt, and all these pyramids of debt in 2008 came crashing down. Now, what is interesting is that in a crisis like that, the classes that are in power politically are still sufficiently resilient to also dictate the way the crisis is being overcome. So the crisis in 2008 was handled by the people who caused it, the speculators, the money dealers, between quotation marks. And they again today are in charge of the economic side of handling the COVID economic crisis, which is again a financial crisis. Although it's politically motivated, as I tried to explain. But in 2008, quantitative easing was used to buy up, you know the term quantitative easing, the central banks buy up the bad debts of banks, and they buy up the state paper, treasury papers of countries that are not so trusted any longer, and they supply the financial institutions with new money to continue basically with what they were doing. To cover that expense, that extra money and extra debt that was created after 2008, we had 12 years of ever deeper austerity. And that austerity in itself is a powerful driver of popular discontent, because people see that their environment, their social environment, is becoming poorer and more dilapidated every year. Now, for the COVID crisis, governments, including central banks, have already spent 20% of the national product of 2019 on new debt, on quantitative easing, on emergency expenditure, and so on and so forth. And the people who are dealing with that, who are writing about that, have said that this time austerity will not be enough. This time there will be a debt which can only be compared to a debt like a war debt, which takes 2 or 3 generations to pay off. So we're no longer talking about closing this or that hospital, or cutting back expenditure for higher education. We're talking about a society which goes the way that Britain went after World War II, which was that 10 years after the war, people were still buying bread with bread tickets. That there was this distribution of elementary amenities. So when you say the structural side of the crisis, how is it connected to the political situation? I would say today we are facing an unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, unprecedented debt, collective debt, which is spread over many societies. Basically, there's no society which is exempt from it, and it's connected to this struggle between the centrist bloc with all its foundations and its state institutions and the NATO security apparatus, the IMF, the World Bank, you name it. And on the other hand, these populist, fascist leaning organizations with Bannon and with, well, your own Bolsonaro, with Trump, with the Brexit, the Johnson government, completely incompetent bunch in power in Britain, and with the far right aspirants in Europe. So that's the connection. The prospect of further deterioration of the economic balances and the revolt of the masses, but revolt which is entirely instrumentalized by far right elements. Now, the other thing that was mentioned is the role of China. I can only say that in the book by Brzezinski, which is called Strategic Vision of 2012, he says that if the United States declines further, you shouldn't be thinking of a world that is then being organized by China. You have to think of a world which is in chaos, because we should always be on our guard against simple repetitions of historical constellations. That's not how it works. There has only been one Pax Americana, and the idea of a Pax Sinica is an illusion. It's also an impossibility, and it doesn't take into account the the more rigid political structure that is now crystallizing in China. I mean, it's not a sign of vitality and progress if a president of China declares himself president for life. That is in itself a crisis, a sign of crisis, a sign of hardening of authoritarian tendencies in that society. There are more and more signs that the opening up of China, and I mean opening up not in an economic sense, but in a political, ideological, and collective psychological sense, that opening up of China that happened under the last few presidents in China is being reversed. So the country is in a problematic situation, also because it has a large American party inside China. There are also shadow banks active in China who are playing with money in the way the speculators in the West are, who are acting as raiders, as pirates in the economy, rather than investing in, well, the one big project that China stands for, which is the OBOR, the large rail and shipping lane project, which aims to connect China to Europe, mainly via Asia. So in that sense, the country is riven by different factions inside, and that weakens it, just as in Russia, you see the same tendencies. A hardening of the leadership, a losing of the initial flexibility, and that can only be a sign of crisis. So basically, my feeling, it's a bit of a somber story, but my feeling is that all these different governments representing different forms of capitalism, speculative neoliberal capitalism in the West and state capitalism plundered by oligarchs in Russia and China, that they are all heading for a sort of conflagration. And that brings me to, if I may, to this idea of 1848. 1848 was a revolt of the peoples in Europe. The response to that was severe repression. repression in France, which brought Napoleon III to power, repression in Eastern Europe, and so on. The ultimate response to the Spring of the People, as it was called at the time, was 1914, the outbreak of the First World War. Via the French-German, French-Prussian War, via the Balkan Wars. 1914 was really the moment when the rival elites of the big European powers came to a conclusion which in a few cases was actually articulated openly. And that was that the best way to deal with the powerful socialist movements in their countries was to send them into the trenches. Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany said that openly in 1905, after the first revolution in Russia, revolution attempt. He said then at the time, and that is in documents, we have to behead the socialists and then send the workers into the trenches. The same, something comparable was heard by Jean Jaurès, the French socialist leader who was actually assassinated on the eve of the First World War, who had a wife in the higher circles. And he also heard that sentiment among the French elite, let's send the workers into the trenches. Now, if we look at the current explosion of discontent, popular discontent, my fear is that a war with China would serve many concerns felt in the United States, which still has this incredible military apparatus, and felt in China, which is being subject to a hardening of and an ossification, rigidification of its political system. So there may again be a sort of meeting of minds, not expressly, but subterranean, and that makes it so urgent that people like ourselves, who have a commitment to a progressive socialist development, should try to interrupt this process, because we won't survive a big central war. That's the issue. That's why I'm concerned in this book with an event that brought the world closer to a major conflagration between NATO and Russia in this case, China in the background. Let's not forget that the United States already bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in the Kosovo air war. When they attacked rump Yugoslavia over the issue of Kosovo. They bombed the Chinese embassy. That was, of course, not a mistake, as they said. That was a sign of some of the hardliners in the American military apparatus that they were willing to take on China. Now, that was more than 20 years ago. That's how we have to assess the danger. There are dangerous adventures on the Western side because it's a declining system, but there's also a hardening in China and an impossibility to respond creatively and in a forward-looking way to the challenges that it faces today, because so many of its own, in its own class structure, are adopting American economic models, American academic standards, etc., and practices. Well, these are unsatisfactory answers, but I hope they give some idea of how I'm thinking.
Okay. Thanks a lot once more. We have another question I don't know if you do have time to any
No,
more
that's fine.
or no.
It's for me. It's a lot later than for you, but well, I'm not. I'm not. I'm not
Yeah,
speaking with
yeah, that's
Brazilian people every day. So please go ahead.
okay. Thanks a lot for your comprehension. Just one question that's it's very interesting one, and I think it's a very nice question in order to close our to, to finish our discussion here. It has too much to a close relationship to things that we were talking before the start of the conference. Um, it's the follow one. You've talked you've talked about the restructuration of the left over the world. Could you detail it a bit more? And is there any movements around the world you would qualify as a positive motion towards the goal? I think that's maybe the second question would be the more interesting in order to develop and to try to say something if you want it.
Yeah. Well, I start with the first because that's the easiest one. The first is um, that large parts of the established trade union movement, and I can't speak for your country, you know that better than I do, but large part of the trade union movement are part of this centrist transnational coalition, if you see what I mean. So of course they are in a very weak position because the rights of trade unionists are being cut back everywhere, but it is a fact that um, the trade unions in Britain or here in the Netherlands are looking at a phenomenon of the far right. And I had experience myself in Germany when I was invited with the big IG Metall, which is the largest trade union of Europe. They invited me to come and talk about the far right. So basically, they wanted to hear that Wilders in the Netherlands, which is our local example of, we have two extreme right parties who are part of this Bannon, Cambridge Analytica sort of network. And they wanted to hear that these people are very bad. And I can assure you they are very bad. But IG Metall, as a trade union in Germany, is extremely closely connected to the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, which is the cause. It's abandoning of the interests of the workers is the direct cause of masses of German workers moving over to what is now the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, which is the far right in Germany, the populist far right. I wouldn't say that they were Nazis, but they are moving in that direction. They're again part of this transnational bloc of far right leaning groups, populists. And so at that conference, I refused to simply condemn the Dutch far rightists, which was what they had invited me for, because my feeling is that you have to step back and see that as a leftist, the greatest concern must be that the parties which used to be the workers' parties, in fact, have abandoned the workers to with their discontent to these far right operators. And well, if I may say so, when my friend Giorgio was here, he identified. Well, let me put it differently. He identified so much with the people with the PT, you know, who has been defeated by Bolsonaro. In the last Monde Diplomatique, there was an article by Singer, I think Andre Singer, on Brazil, in which he also sided with the governors in Brazil who had imposed lockdowns against the wishes of uh, the president, who behaves in ways that are very concerning. He compared it. He compared him in that article with Mussolini because he arrived on horseback in at a demonstration or some event. But I thought to myself, why don't you step back? And I said that to Giorgio as well. I said it to, I would say it to Andre Singer. Why don't you step back and see that you shouldn't criticize the far right? I mean, they are the far right. We don't have to spend much time with them. They are dangerous extremists who dream of resurrecting the military dictatorship. But our concern should be the behavior of the established left, which missed so many chances, which lacked such a real analysis of the situation in which they were briefly, well, I wouldn't say in power, but close to power. Um, and well, Latin America is always the laboratory of social change. It has always been. Just as France and Italy in Europe are laboratories of social change. In these countries, you can see which grand historical developments, which grand historical um, strategies are being executed and what their shortcomings are. We should study these just as you should study Latin American history in that respect. I must study first of all French and Italian history because they are so important. There you can see which steps were taken that were right, which steps were taken that proved to be deeply wrong. Why is Le Pen so powerful in France? You know, there's no, I will never uh, be indignant about Marine Le Pen and say, "Wow, it's a scandal. She's a racist and this and that." Yeah, of course she is. The question is, what did we do? What did we do? What did our side do to ultimately become responsible for the fact that French workers, French farmers say that the only hope they have is this woman, and so on and so forth. That's the easy part. So the easy part is to say the mainstream socialists, and I can't judge. It's a pity that Giorgio is in the plane now. He can't judge. He can't join us because I have an enormous respect for this man as a thinker and somebody of great knowledge. But I hope there will be a chance that he can come back and attack what I just say. I don't know to what extent the PT fits into this description that I give, for instance, of the German Social Democratic Party, which is of course much to the right. But I fear that they still belong to the centrist bloc, you know, outliers, of course, but to the centrist bloc. Now, and then the difficult question is, can you point to a movement which is promising and so on and so forth? The answer is painful, and it is no, I can't. I see day in, day out, hundreds and hundreds of people who write on a personal title in social media with very valid positions on this or that topic. So there is a mass base, a potential mass base for visionary leadership in a socialist tradition, but it doesn't exist at this moment. It's painful, you know, because even the governments that are that I found extremely sympathetic, let's say Evo Morales in until he was deposed by coup in Bolivia, have to make decisions because their countries are being squeezed by international obligations that are very damaging to the movement that they represent. So you can't say, well, they're great and in that sense, even Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, of course, was a fantastic, inspiring figure. But the Cubans had to tell him all the time, do something about the structure of your economy. Don't just hand out chicken to the poor, because at one point, you will have missed a chance to change your society for the better. So it's not easy. We live in an age in which there are no more heroes. There are no more poster figures like Ho Chi Minh or Che Guevara. Maybe they were never what we thought they were. Anyway, we live in an age in which we are facing the outcome of very serious mistakes that were being made over many, many decades. And I'm always talking about our mistake, the mistakes of our side. Not the others, I'm not so much interested in, except for documentary reasons. And that means that we have no illusions. We cannot point simply to the Occupy movement or, that sort of thing. We can only see that the left has been defeated to a degree which is world historical, and that therefore the recovery of the intellectual heritage that is available. I mean, you as a specialist on Gramsci will agree that we live in the age now in which the armor of coercion, which is below the appearance of compromise and consensus, that the armor of coercion is now visible. It's for all to see. We live in coercive circumstances, and it's that sort of insight that has to be brought forward again and integrated. And only when we have understood the predicament of our type of society, which is already different, of course, will we ever be able to begin to unite and convince the people who we now individually meet from time to time, who have worthwhile things to say, to bring them together into a single, I can't even say movement, but a trend in society, a current in society, which will, to some extent, will also be electronic, because that is the modern form of communication as we're seeing today. But there is no utopian ideal type of a current left movement that we all should follow. In my view, it doesn't exist, except that there are millions of individual people who are inspiring and responsible and talented in the sense for the areas that we're discussing. I hope I'm not too gloomy.
No, thanks a lot, Professor. I think that this moment is a very, very, every moment is a particular moment, in fact, but I think that we have some particular aspects of this, our juncture, that makes it a very, very different from some examples and some possibilities that we faced decades before. And maybe to think a little bit more about the role of intellectuals, to think a little bit more about subalterns, to think a little bit more about this process would be very insightful for the left, in my opinion. I think to try to get off of every vicious that it would be possible would be very, very helpful to construct, try to maintain the intention to construct as a better society, society more just, more equal, more environmental conscious, and more peaceful. I think that would be very important to take attention of these things. And in this sense, I think that challenges are very deep, challenges are very, very hard, but the pessimism must be in the analysis and the optimism in the actions, you know.
Yes,
And
exactly.
that's the idea. So once more, just to finish, thank you very much, Professor. It was very interesting, very clear, your speech, and I think that would be very interesting for us in Brazil, for many of us, and not only from Brazil. You have some people from other places also that take part with us today, and hope to see you soon in presence
Okay.
or virtual, whatever. Uh,
Okay.
Thanks a lot, and
Many
see you.
thanks. Many thanks to you. Thank you.